Have you ever found out something about a person that was shocking, that as you knew them while you were friends or colleagues, co-workers, that they were going through a hellish season and you had no idea about it until afterwards? Or maybe you knew a little bit, but you didn't know the depths of it. Well, sometimes it's shocking to get the whole story. And Pastor Mark Chironna, who's been in ministry for decades, who's a scholar, and who is a man who believes in the power of God to set the captives free, he shared his own story now in a book titled On the Edge of Hope. No matter how dark the night, the redeemed soul still sings. Hey, Mark, welcome to the Line of Fire.
Great to be here.
So let me ask first, before we get into any details, why did you decide to write this book? I mean, it's raw, it's vulnerable. Why'd you do it?
Michael, that's a great question. I wrestled. And obviously, the period of time that I wrote about took place from 2007 to 2010 and a half. And I think it took me this long because I think it took me a while to process it all and to feel secure enough and strong enough to be able to tell the story for the sake of others. And so when I had been sharing a bit about it at a meeting, and one of the agents from Baker was there, from Chosen, and they said, Mark, would you be willing to write the book on this? And while I said yes, I said it with a little bit of hesitation in my voice because I had to revisit the journey in order to do that. So there were some painful places I had to go, and I think there was an unconscious awareness that if I ever were to tell the story, I'd have to go back and revisit some things that we prefer to try to forget.
Yeah.
So, but I finally felt like God was saying it was time, and there were people that were hurting, and it might be an appropriate time to be self-disclosing for their sake.
So Mark, as far as in your professional academic career, do you have any degrees or have you done any studies that tie in with the question of human psychology? You're in pastoral ministry. I know other scholarship you've done, but what interfaces with that?
Yeah, I was 43 credits away from my PhD in psychology when I hit that perfect storm that is part of the story of the book.
All right. So you've counseled many people over the years as a pastor.
Yes.
You were doing advanced degrees in psychology, and now you find yourself in this dark night of the soul. Hey, why don't you just pull yourself out of it, man? Come on. You're a man. Just pull yourself out. Why doesn't that work?
Yeah, and if Michael, we both know each other really well, and we know the body of Christ really well. So you already know that I heard that from a lot of people. It was the obvious question. It's not a whole lot different than Jesus in his hometown saying, "No doubt you would quote this proverb, physician, heal thyself." I think the irony of our humanness is that we really can't help ourselves, that God calls us to be other-oriented, and even if we have all the logical, rational, reasonable answers, when we're going through what we go through, we lose our sense of perspective, and other people have to mirror back to us the love of God so that we can regain our footing and our grounding and be able to move forward. So we need one another, and I think that lesson that season taught me a level of needing others in a way that perhaps no other season in my life did.
All right. So before we talk about coming through this, coming out of it, again, friends, the name of the book, On the Edge of Hope, paint a picture of what you were going through, what life was like during this 3.5-year period, and whether you were still functioning professionally, ministry-wise, during this season. Yeah. What did it look like and feel like?
Okay, so up until, even through that moment, I was, Michael, both you and I were immersed in an atmosphere of renewal, refreshing revival. We're both passionate about the move of God. I use the phrase blowing and going. Between my appearances on television and my travel around the world and around the nation, meetings every week of the month, traveling here, there, and everywhere, and almost with an endless pull on that deposit in your life when you feel like you've got something that God has given you to share with others. And that was a way of life. And I didn't see if I had seen the bus coming, I'd have gotten out of the way. But there were a number of instances that led to a perfect storm. And I don't talk about all of them in the book for the sake of privacy, but one of them was we were in the middle of a major building acquisition, and we went from a $7,000 a month mortgage to a $70,000 a month first mortgage and $50,000 a month balloon.
Oh my!
And we had a few thousand people, but when we relocated, the majority of those people decided not to come, and I was down to 400 adults. And the stress of that financial pressure began to build over that next few months. When we got in the building in December of 2006, I felt the weight of that financial stress. Now, mind you, I thought I was pretty confident about my ability to encourage people to give and to steward that kind of a building project. And I was on TBN. I helped them raise money for the gospel all around the world, and so I felt pretty confident. But when that anxiety hit me, it was intense. And then within that, we went through a season with our younger son that led to affect the whole family, and it about did me in, and it lasted for a long time. And the stress of that, plus the stress of the finances, put a weight on me that I had never experienced in my life, and it crushed me. It literally crushed me.
So Mark, what's the difference between going through a hard time, going through a battle, and suffering from real depression? What's the difference?
Oh, gosh. I've been through tough seasons in my journey before. We both have. We've both had our share of spiritual warfare.
Yep.
But this, and at a season in my life when I was going through major transition, I remember feeling disoriented and despairing. But honestly, Michael, when Paul says to the church at Corinth in 2 Corinthians that he didn't want them to be unaware of the struggle he went through, that when he was on his way, that in Asia he was excessively burdened to the point of despairing of life, that the sentence of death had been passed in him, that he shouldn't trust in himself but in God who raises the dead. I know what that's like now. I also know what it's like when Job says, the thing that I greatly fear has come upon me. We have so misinterpreted that text, and you're Jewish, so you know that the Hebrew ways of looking at wisdom literature are different than the American way of saying this says this at a surface level. And but between the thing that I greatly fear, the way it's understood Hebraically and the way it's understood in wisdom literature, and the despairing of life, they both came together with a force that had to be reckoned with. And ironically, Michael, you met Vinny Manzo at Issachar, but Vinny was one of my best friends, and I dedicated the book to him, and he just passed away last week, so he never got to see a copy of the book. But he walked me through that season, and if it weren't for him, I'm not sure where I'd be.
So this went on not for 3.5 days or weeks or months, but 3.5 years?
Years, yeah, 3.5. It was a long, long, dark night.
So did you have breakthroughs where everything seemed normal and you thought, I'm out of this, I'm done, and fell back? Or was it was dark the whole time?
It was the entire time, and the sleeplessness was chronic. And I had to also see a therapist and the medical doctors, and they tried me on various medications, most of which gave me problems and there were challenges all the way around. But I'm grateful for Jesus, and I'm grateful for the enduring love of God, and for the key voices in my life that kept reminding me of who I was, and that this was a season and not a life sentence.
And during this time, who was God to you, and how real was he to you?
You know, it was a season where it felt like God had totally abandoned me. I knew God was there, but it was as if the one who I had so thought I knew well went radio silent. I could sense the presence, but I had no sense of a living word to run with. I had to rely on Vinny and some caring others just to remind me of what God had said. And, you know, obviously I went to Scripture. You know, one of the verses that became a life verse for me was Deuteronomy 33, in the eternal God, 26:27. The eternal God is our dwelling place, and underneath are the everlasting arms. It didn't matter how far I felt like I fell, but the Father's arms, the Son and the Spirit, undergirded me and caught me up and sustained me. There were times I didn't realize I was being sustained. There were times I thought I was going to lose it, and yet in moments when I thought I was going to lose it, there was just this clarity that would remind me, I got to just keep going. And, you know, at the same time, Michael, I've made my living on the road. I've not taken a salary from the church. I never have. And the last few years, the church has begun to give me something. But so I had to still function while I wasn't able to function and generate income to take care of what was going on in my family, well, the daily bills, the daily chores. Plus, I had to continue to preach and sustain the local church. And so I was clear in the pulpit, but everywhere else I wasn't.
Extraordinary. Friends, the book, On the Edge of Hope, no matter how dark the night, the redeemed soul still sings. How did God bring Mark out of this, and what would he say to those in the midst of it? That's what we'll take up when we come back. Stay right here. My guest, Dr. Mark Chironna, says this: the scariest place can also be your threshold. Step through it, knowing God is there with you, and healing can happen right in the middle of your chaos. The book, On the Edge of Hope. So, Mark, how is it that the Lord brought you out of this 3.5-year dark night of the soul?
Well, it wasn't a 1, 2, 3 sort of solution. It was a gradual learning how to cope with anxiety and learning how to cope with the oppression and learning how to cope with the depression. There were many things I had to learn about negative emotions, afflictive thoughts. I had to really get free from magical thinking that if I just confess the word, it'll go away. I certainly think there's a place for confession, don't get me wrong, but magical thinking is not the way through some of the kind of afflictive internal realities I was facing. It only happened one step at a time, one day at a time. I had to live in day-tight compartments. I had enough grace to manage one day at a time. Looking back, it was 1,800 and some odd days. It was 78 days or something like that, but I knew them each as one long day, and many of those nights were sleepless nights. So how I made it through was really one step at a time, Michael, and it was difficult. I don't want to soft soap it, because it was pretty painful, but I think I realized somewhere in the journey that the more I fought it, the more power I gave it. And I had to learn to accept that there are just some things that are negative in life that if we embrace the reality that it hurts, it loses its power. And that took me a while, because I was pretty determined I was going to lick the thing right away, and I had to learn there was a different way through this one.
What about demonic factors and deliverance from demons? Is that in the category of magic also? Where does that fit?
No, I think, look, the demonic is real, and the demonic can be there. And certainly when the demonic was there, I had to address it. It wasn't as if, now I'm familiar with deliverance. This wasn't a matter of me needing to be delivered. This was a matter of my soul was, I was battling deep anguish and sadness and grief and anxiety. And the enemy takes advantage of that. He comes at us when we're down. And so I had to, on the one hand, the deal with the spiritual warfare, which was exhausting in and of itself because it was relentless, and at the same time deal with the anxiety and the depression. So it was a pretty intense reality. So I'm not denying either dimension. I'm saying both was a double whammy.
Yep.
It was intense.
Yep, got it. And many times we are way too simplistic. It's either or, and whatever helped the last, if God uses me a particular way, well, that's going to fix it for everybody. And then that only drives things deeper. People may mean well, but it only drives the hopelessness deeper. So obviously, for those that are listening and you're saying, wow, this is relevant to me, or I've got a family member, friend that could really use this. So the book will help. In other words, the book is not 3.5 years, dark night of the soul, and then the last page, I came out of it. I mean, you've got the journey through the midst of it and the journey out by God's grace. So there is hope throughout. But in short now, if you were talking to someone that's watching or listening to the broadcast, or they're going to read your book, and they just don't see any way out. They can't even see that they're on the edge of hope, and they're believers. They're children of God. What would you say to them?
Number one, we are loved by God. Nothing will separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. The triune God is a God of love, and he will always be loyal in that love. Whether I understand the sufferings I'm going through or not does not change who God is. God is not the author of evil. God didn't will that I go through this thing, and God didn't determine that I had to suffer these things. Some of the sufferings, Michael, that we go through are the genuine sufferings of Christ. Some of the sufferings we go through are the result of our brokenness and our areas where our cognitions are not as clear as they need to be. And so it's not always easy to sort all those out, but either way, it's suffering, and we have to deal with it. But we have to know we're loved. That's number one. Number two, we can't run away from negative thoughts and negative feelings. The only way out is through. And I thought if I accepted those thoughts, I was accepting defeat. And I had to realize there's a difference between accepting those negative thoughts and feelings and resigning myself to them. And when I realized I had to accept the pain without resigning myself to it, I got in touch with that deeper core that was in Mark Chironna from the day he was saved, that God had ordained my life for his purpose and his glory. And when I chose to stay in that core place, come hell or high water, I resolved I would go through for the sake of Jesus, for the sake of my wife and my kids, for the sake of the people I love at the local church, and for the sake of the body of Christ.
Mm. And Mark, a lot of the gospel that's preached in America is very superficial because often we don't have suffering attached to it. We don't really have a theology of suffering. There's not often a cost to pay for following Jesus, as is common in other countries where persecution is very real. Do you think with that we have presented a false picture of what it means to be born again, walk with the Lord, a false picture of the gospel, and that contributes to our problems because we're not expecting difficulty?
Oh, gosh, Michael, you and I could talk about this for hours. As a matter of fact, you and I need to do a podcast where I interview you on this, because I think this is such an important topic. I mean, when Paul speaks of the sufferings of Christ, and he talks about the spirit of glory and the spirit of suffering go together. Somehow, where we lost our way, I think, was we got so embroiled in, I want to be very careful how I say this, because look, we both are involved in media. We both love the fact that God has graced us with the ability to touch a lot of people. I'm grateful to God for every opportunity. I'm grateful for all the men and women of God that have poured into my life. The challenge, I think, in the American culture is that we've become a celebrity culture, and there's this drivenness to 15 minutes of fame, which is very short-lived. And with that, there's this syndrome that comes that you think you're impervious to the human condition and to suffering, when God never promises us that we're not going to suffer. Many are the afflictions of the righteous, but the Lord delivers him from them all. And I do think right now, Michael, and I trust you agree with me, that if revival is going to come, it's not when the roof is going to blow up. It's going to when the bottom falls out. Woe is me, I am undone, for I am a man of... I know that's not popular to confess that, but Isaiah confessed that. Peter falls down in the boat at the feet of Jesus and says, "Depart from me, I'm a sinful man." And Jesus says, "Don't worry, we're going to start catching people." But there's something about a broken and a contrite spirit that I think is essential to the move of the Spirit. And that brokenness is that place where we're willing to allow the pains of the human condition to touch us at our core. And I don't think there's any other way around that.
Yeah, I was just looking at a quote from Samuel Chadwick, who was the teacher of Leonard Ravenhill, in one of my books that I was quoting in another book. And he said, the church always fails at the point of self-confidence. And there is that aspect, like you quoted from 2 Corinthians 1. Paul saying, we felt the sentence of death. Why? So we wouldn't trust in ourselves, but in God who raises us from the dead. And so out of this hellish season that you went through, good has come out of it, right? And it has brought you more into the character of Jesus, which is the ultimate goal that God has for our lives.
Yeah. I mean, and, there would have been a day when if people came up to me and said they were battling anxiety, I would have quoted a few Bible verses and prayed for them. I can't do that anymore. I feel their pain now, and I have a whole different approach because I understand how anxiety works, and simply quoting Paul or Jesus on anxiety without going into the depths of what Paul is saying about the nature of anxiety and the nature of what supplication is, which requires bringing those deep pains to speech and owning what's behind them. Prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, which is not always easy when you're going through that hellish place. Saying thank you to God in the midst of that, in spite of that, that's tough stuff. So yeah, I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy, but I wouldn't trade where I am now for the world because I'm so in love with Jesus. I love Jesus more today than I've ever loved him before.
Yeah, and that's the reality of God's redemption. You hope to never go through something like that, but you realize you wouldn't be who you were without it. Friends, the new book just out today, On the Edge of Hope, no matter how dark the night, the redeemed soul still sings, a book that very few people could write because the depth of the story is something that some never come out of. So thank God we're in the midst of hope. We're in the midst of the reality of God's redemption. This book will minister to you. And Mark, you tell me when, and we'll do that podcast. God bless.
I'll have Misty call you. Love you much, Mike.
Love you too. God bless. Hey, friends, I hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, click on one of the boxes on the screen, check out another one of our videos, and be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss a single video. We discovered that about 60% of you that are watching our videos aren't subscribers. So subscribe today. Doesn't cost you a dime. And if you want to support our work, Line of Fire, and all the things that we do, follow one of the links on the screen below.